As we'll talk about today, there's more and more because of technology opportunities, not just to have like immediate access to information, but to try to use technology to trick us into thinking that a student actually wrote what they wrote. So when we go through this today, there's a nuts and bolts component more towards the end, which is how to set up, turn it in a Canvas class, and the interface has changed a little bit. I think it's a little bit nicer, but the beginning part of this will go over like almost the foundations and how we got to where we are in terms of plagiarism. I'll even show you some sites, pretty shocking. There are quite a few paper mill sites, and they purportedly have actual professors, people who I'm sure they disguise their names, but they write papers for students, and you pay upwards, it could be $11 a page, and they even have a system set up so the student can choose to have a C quality paper written, which seems kind of smart, right, from the perspective of trying to trick someone, because the idea is if you turn in a paper that isn't amazing and an A quality paper written by a graduate student or something like that, you might fool the professor that way. So I've been talking about plagiarism since really the early 90s, since I was teaching in some form as a TA, we were just starting to see it happening, but none of it was technological. It was all a student would go and copy from a book. There wasn't the internet back in those days. I'm dating myself quite a bit, but nowadays, of course, with the era of cutting and pasting, it's just so much easier for students to kind of have immediate access to information and to, sorry, my mouse was a little slow there, and to be able to just access things at the touch of a finger, a few strokes on the keyboard. So I'll talk here first what sort of experts in the field consider about plagiarism. The basic definition, which we know of here, and I'm recording this, so any of you watching this afterwards, you'll get a chance to watch this video if you didn't see it live. But plagiarism, as we know, is presenting someone else's work as your own ideas as your own, with or without consent. Typically, I think it's without consent. I don't hear about a lot of, you can use my words to plagiarize a paper. I think it's typically without consent. By incorporating it into your work without full acknowledgement, all published and unpublished material, whether in manuscript, printed, or electronic form, is covered under this definition. And again, this is just the University of Oxford, what they have, and every school across the country has their own statement of what defines plagiarism and academic dishonesty, and we'll indeed look at ours later, and we'll also go over the template that you can download into your class if you want to have that as part of Canvas. And I should say at the beginning, we should really talk about two forms of cheating under the sort of umbrella of academic dishonesty. So plagiarism is typically words. It would be a paper that you copy, although Steve Richardson said in computer science that there's plagiarism that happens with coding. So someone can copy a code and then not give the attribution and present it as their own. And so that could be plagiarism in a non-narrative world. And of course, we have cheating of all sorts. So cheating on their chemistry exams, students cheating in a math class or whatever. I think it's easier to do that because we are virtual now, and I know some of you are teaching hybrid, teaching some in person. We will talk about Proctorio, and that might be particularly useful for the sciences and math because I think there's more of an emphasis on in-person exams to really show what you know, and it's often important to make sure that students are not cheating. So when we talk about cheating or academic dishonesty, we're talking about plagiarism of the sort that happens in papers or discussion posts, and we're also talking about anyone who cheats on an exam or a quiz. So it's just important to know the definitions. The examples of plagiarism that you can look at are pretty useful, and there are a lot of these sources on the internet. So you'll see a source text and then someone plagiarizes it, and typically they take the original text and they alter it in some way, and we'll look at this later. And there are two main types of alteration. One is where someone is trying to change words around in such a way that they maybe fool you or the plagiarism software. The other one is more technological, and it's using, it could be any kind of foreign character to replace, say, an E with a Cyrillic E or something like that. Or even putting dummy text, I'll show you what this looks like later, in between every word in a sentence, changing that dummy text to white, as opposed to the black text, the auto text that is the text, and hoping that that will fool Turnitin. Fortunately, as we'll talk about, Turnitin has kept up with all these tricks over the years, and so I think they've done a pretty good job with making sure that students can't hopefully get around some of those safety nets, if you will, or checks in plagiarism software. So if you look at this as a cultural issue, I always explain to my students, I don't approach this when I talk to them on the first day of class about plagiarism and academic dishonesty. I don't assume any of them will be doing this. And I actually say, the truth is it's happening everywhere, right? There's a lot of cheating that goes on. David Callahan's book, The Cheating Culture, talks about this. So I would argue there's a value issue here somewhere in American culture where we maybe don't appreciate originality, or we look to take shortcuts to get a job or to get a degree. And we'll talk about this later. One of my colleagues who has since retired, Beachy Orr, who taught anatomy and physiology, always said, there's consequence to cheating. If you cheat your way through anatomy and physiology and you become a nurse or a doctor and then you kill someone, and there have been some recent cases in the news of people being convicted for all sorts of medical malpractice, there is an actual consequence to cheating, to not knowing the information and then getting a degree that is probably not worth what it says on that piece of paper. But this is really a cultural issue, and you can see here all across the world, presidents of universities, people giving commencement speeches, famous authors we'll look at in a bit here, writing books, and they're plagiarizing. So it's not just students, and I think it's important to emphasize in your class that you're not trying to be the cop on the first day or the fifth week of class if you're talking about it for midterms, and assuming that they're necessarily, going to plagiarize. I think knowing the penalties, knowing that there's technology protecting our classes, is one good opportunity just to give students a minor form of deterrence, not like really major where you're assuming that they're going to be doing bad things and cheating and so forth. It is an issue, I would argue, but it's something that you can handle with maybe a little bit of nuance and not just go into it assuming that, hey, you guys, I'm not assuming you're cheating necessarily. So these are just famous cases. Helen Keller, different famous authors out there, written famous books, literary books. Thomas Pynchon, famous author defending Ian McEwan. Charles Green, I don't know all of these. Bob Dylan plagiarizing SparkNotes for his Nobel Prize lecture. So, I think there's awareness in our culture about this issue, but at the same time, we still see it, I think, happening somewhat frequently in our classes. I thought this was pretty interesting. Social scientist in me is always like, well, what can we learn from plagiarism? And this is actually a study of German and Slovene students. And true story in my case, I didn't pick it because of this, but a couple of years back, I had a visiting position over the summer, and I went into it kind of with this assumption where I thought, all these European students are going to be super amazing, and they're going to, be the best students, and I'm never going to see anything like plagiarism. Well, the students had to do a final project in the class, and there were 2 or 3 straight up plagiarized projects that were directly taken from Wikipedia. And it was one of those things, and I think, if you've been doing this a while, you start to, because of your discipline, if you're teaching audio production or chemistry or sociology or anthropology, you begin to understand if someone writes something a certain way, the lingo, and you say, well, this sounds kind of like a research paper, or it sounds like someone who really is like a professional in that field wrote this. And that first little suspicion or light bulb that goes off often leads you into the direction of doing more research. So, indeed, I had a student who wrote something on experimental music on the work of John Cage, and I know that literature pretty well, having started off as a music major before I got into this anthropology thing. And, I looked it up, and it was a very easy find. It was on Wikipedia, and it was just paragraph by paragraph, cut and paste, easy to find. I gave the student an F. And I was I was disappointed because again, I went into the class with these assumptions that plagiarism is more kind of an American thing just because of some of our values. Unfortunately, it's not the case. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And this particular article looked at the factors that we can attribute to plagiarism again in these non-U.S. cases. Um, One factor could be the students do not understand clearly what plagiarism is. So the honest mistake, and I have to say, I give my students benefit of the doubt. So in the first instance of this, if it doesn't seem like an egregious, their whole paper is a Wikipedia page, I will write to the student and say, hey, I'm going to give you a second chance. I want you to rewrite this because you cannot cut and paste information from the internet. In fact, I want you to have original ideas and synthesize what you're reading on the internet or in our articles or textbooks. So not knowing what plagiarism is maybe the first step in giving students what they need to know to define, hey, by the way, this is what is plagiarism in my class. And that's one of the arguments I'll make at the end, is to clearly define what plagiarism is for your class. Furthermore, this talks about how information is easy to find with new technology. So you can jump on the internet and it's super easy to find this kind of stuff. Hey, Sean, you have your hand up. Go ahead. And anytime, please interrupt.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you a chance to finish your sentence. Um, so I've had some run-ins with plagiarism in the past, and I do agree that them knowing what is plagiarism is an important first step, and that wound up being why the student was not punished that much.
Mm-hmm.
But in my mind, that did not hold water because she had gone to the trouble of reformatting the hyperlinks in a copy and pasted Wikipedia article. She reformatted the hyperlinks to be not underlined in black text, but she didn't remove them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you think intent comes into play?
Oh, I think it does. Yeah. I think it does. And again, it's your call on this because it's your discipline and you're the expert. But I've had that exact situation where a Wikipedia link wasn't removed, and you're kind of like, yeah, there is intent here. So, you could set up a system. You could have a structure where you say the first time you do it, I will deduct 1 letter grade or 2 letter grades. The second case, because you received the warning from me, will be an automatic F. It's totally up to you. But having done this a long time, like both of you, I think really, yeah, intent should play a role in it. It's hard to get into the mind of a student. Sometimes students, think, well, everyone else is doing it, so it's okay for me to do it. But you really, I think, have to make that call, for sure. But intent is, I would say, a big part of it. And it relates to honesty. And that's why years ago, I was on the team of folks who drafted the plagiarism policy. We added a stipulation there about any student at LTCC who's involved in student government, or they're chairing a club, or they're on a big committee, or they're the board rep or whatever, because we had a pretty well, I wouldn't say what it was. We had a student years ago who we needed that consequence for, because this particular student was involved in a lot of campus activities. And that gets really to this issue of values and honesty. When I used to teach at Valparaiso University in Northwest Indiana, all the students had to write an honesty statement in every single assignment that they submitted, a paper, a quiz, and it was, I can't remember it offhand, but it was, I have neither given nor received aid in the completion of my work. And the attitude was this would get them to say, I am not cheating, or I realize the consequences of it. And they actually had student discipline panels. And I was on one once where a student clearly had cheated and was turned in by another student, and we went through this whole discipline panel. And unfortunately, they found in favor of the student. And I gave testimony. It was like a quasi legal proceeding. And so some universities have taken it to that level to say it's really about values. And the university I was teaching at was a Lutheran school, so it was also, I think, tied in with religious values. And it's obviously a good value that if you are a Lutheran student, not that you had to be, but hopefully you weren't cheating and committing academic dishonesty, because that would probably go against a lot of religious values out there. So intent, I think, is really key, and I think we have to really look at that in our own classes. So anyway, good question there. The second point was just about technology is there, it's available, so therefore we have to be aware of that, and students obviously take advantage of it in good and bad ways. And then the third point here is talking about if students are entering your class and only interested in getting the grade to get the piece of paper to graduate, and not like, oh, I want to learn about chemistry because one of these days I want to open my own brewery, and I want to learn because I need to know everything about chemistry to be a good brewer. Well, if the student is just taking chemistry because they need it to get their engineering degree or whatever, and that could then have an influence on the propensity or possibility that they might plagiarize. Not always the case, but this study is suggesting that. Poor preparation could also be time management, could relate to this. So again, if students lack skills, hopefully we're giving more of those skills through our promise class when our students enter, that they learn about cheating, they learn about time management, they learn about good quality education as far as being good students. Academic skills and not knowing how to cite. It's a huge thing in an English class. You go through various formats of citation. Same thing in a social science class. And sometimes students don't know how to do it. And so therefore you can give them that second chance. So going back to Sean's question, I think I feel like if it's an honest mistake and they didn't have that intent to cheat or to spend all that amount of time doing tricky things, then I'm a little more open to giving that student a second chance. If it's just a pure cut and paste job, the question becomes like, if I don't teach them a lesson now, what's going to happen when they go into the next class that's not mine, and maybe the instructor doesn't track plagiarism as carefully as I do. And then lastly, could be values and attitudes towards plagiarism. Does the school have clear policies? Are those policies communicated? So again, I think these are really great themes in this short study that we can use out in the U.S. context here. Northern Illinois University talked about this as well. They mentioned some causes of plagiarism. These are very similar, things like peer pressure, performance anxiety. So I think we do a pretty good job at LTCC trying to make it a less intense academic environment in terms of maybe that pressure. We still hopefully are rigorous, but hopefully we're not so intense that students really resort to plagiarism or cheating because there's such an emphasis on say in a really hard class, to get an A, you have to do more work, and as a result of that, maybe students are inclined to cut corners and try to cheat and so forth. And I've had at LTCC over the years, back in the old days when we didn't have a lot of the internet, it was more traditional cheating. So I caught a student once really sloppy, a big cheat sheet. It fell in the middle of the exam, and I picked it up, and I was kind of mad. I kind of threw it in the garbage, and he kind of just put his head down and walked out of the room. And of course, he knew he was getting an F. So it's more sophisticated, I think, what was happening now. But again, some of these factors could lead to students maybe committing academic dishonesty, plagiarism, cheating on an exam, and so forth. Making excuses, cannot manage demands of student life. This is something that a lot of you involved in student life activities with the Promise program or with dual enrollment, certainly a lot of interest, I think, in trying to make the life of the student, not just during COVID, but before and after COVID, more easy to handle. Try to really give students skills that they can use such that they're not thinking about cutting corners and cheating and so forth. And that unfamiliarity with what constitutes dishonesty, I think, is a real big key one, and that's why we have to emphasize this in our classes with the policies that we'll be looking at. So here are some real world examples. I've redacted names, and this gets to, like Sean gave an example earlier, where it's a clear cut and paste. You can even find the hyperlinks still active, which is pretty sloppy. My favorite story is years ago when I was doing it the old way and trying to determine, it was really hard to do without the internet and something like Turnitin, but I had someone turn in a final project. This was back in the mid-90s when I was teaching at that university I mentioned in Indiana. Someone had, failed to take out of their plagiarism the word research team. So they kept referring to the research team. And I said, this is pretty good. You're a second-year student in sociology and you have your own research team. Well, clearly they didn't. They forgot to take that out. So even in the old days when we didn't have Turnitin, there were certain things that you could tell immediately. As a social scientist, if certain words make it in a paper, again, I'm not assuming, being elitist, that a student wouldn't know some of those vocabulary words, but just how those words are used and how they're put into a sentence, you can easily begin to tell in a lot of cases that something's wrong. The light bulb goes off and you say, I need to investigate more. And so in cases where it's not super obvious, like in this case, I read this, these were discussion posts on medical anthropology, and there's a couple quotations here, which they probably just, cut and pasted directly from these sources. But as you can see, it was very easy. Like this, with this in mind, is urgent for us to understand that as people continue to migrate and interact, the value of one's culture is not always shaped by Western thought. Doesn't that kind of sound like... Again, I'm not trying to be... I think there's an elitism that could crop up here, and I'm not trying to be that, because I've had ISP students that write at a graduate student level. So I'm not saying in an elitist sense that you couldn't have a student write that sentence. But if that little, light bulb goes off and you say, that's when you investigate step 2. Step 1 is a sense that you have that maybe someone did plagiarize. Step 2 is putting that through Turnitin, Vericite, the program that we have, to just see, are you on to something? Does it seem like these are maybe direct cut and paste from the internet? And indeed these were, and a lot of examples of these that, sorry, my cursor's being a little slow, that I have found over the years. This is one of the more shocking ones. I don't know what, this was an anthropology class where I think we were talking about travel. So they wrote a few things in their own words. Through the travel, I have gained more insights into the beauty of nature. But what was shocking to me was they copied someone who wrote a first-person perspective experience about visiting the Grand Canyon, right? So not only are they cheating, but they're using someone else's words who, I don't know where this came from, but they clearly had a memorable experience going to the Grand Canyon. I find that shocking because someone is using the word I, so it's really lacking kind of the sensibility to say, you're being inauthentic as a person by copying someone else's first-person trip experience from the Grand Canyon. So this is both shocking to me and also a good wake-up, because you might gloss over this and say, first person, they're talking about the Grand Canyon. It's not written in a way that is particularly verbose. Every person I know who's ever had the privilege of visiting this incredible example of Mother Nature's engineering say there's nothing like blah, 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 witnessing the beauty. That doesn't really sound like, it's very technically written, so it doesn't seem like plagiarism. So the challenge of working with these kinds of narratives is that on the surface, because they're first person and because they're not super verbose and have a lot of academic jargon, they don't seem like plagiarism. And that's a reminder that there's probably more of this going on than we realize. Now, this is an example from a class where a student didn't have a ton. It wasn't like those last examples, entire paragraphs, little bits. So this is what's nice about our software, is it will take you to the internet source and you could look at these side by side. So I can see they're talking here about a particular religious, this is for my, I think, anthropology of religion class, talking about the Christian cross and so forth. So they had little bits and pieces. But again, as I've defined plagiarism in my class, I say you cannot use even a string of 5 words, because I want you to write things in your own language, in your own interpretations and so forth. So it's not always the case that a student will plagiarize entire sections. And this was one years ago. This was one that actually went through some level of, I'll just say, conversation at the college. But sometimes you will have a student who you give them an F, you fail them in the class, and they want to contest the grade. So one recommendation I would make is to have backups, to save screenshots, to save PDFs of all the information, because it might be 6 months later, the student files a complaint with the instruction office, which is certainly their right to do, because there's a chance that we made mistakes and the student can prove themselves in terms of saying, well, no, I didn't plagiarize. But this one was very tricky to deal with because the student had left words out. And so they took parts of definitions. This was the sociology class talking about alienation in the workplace. So as you can see, when you start to take off these bits, sometimes plagiarism programs, or certainly a direct Google search, will not always discover this as plagiarized. And I actually spent, I want to say, about 10 hours on this particular case because I had to very carefully document what the student did. So the student wasted all this time, and then I wasted all this time. So it's really a frustrating thing. And since this is talking about work and alienation, it would be interesting for someone to study the amount of waste, economic waste, time waste, labor waste that is spent by both students and professors and administrators and assistants dealing with plagiarism. So I think that's kind of interesting because we spend a lot of time, sometimes you might spend hours and hours just trying to prove your case, looking very carefully because sometimes the plagiarism software doesn't detect these cases. So some reminders on this, to go back to what Sean asked earlier, you decide on the enforcement. It's really up to you. We're all the experts in our fields. And a one-stop policy, or a one concept policy, if we will, as we'll look at later, is not going to allow you flexibility. So the plagiarism statement and academic dishonesty statement in the catalog is open to you to interpret, and you decide in the enforcement. What level of riffing off of others' work or copying constitutes plagiarism in your class? Like Solange, if you're doing an audio production class or you're doing a video production class, and you someone turns in, that it could easily happen, right? They could find a mix online, they could find tracks, they could find video, and if they turn that in and present it as their own work, maybe you need to clearly say that is not going to be allowable. Or they're doing a social media post where they have to do graphic design and they copy something from the web. It would be very easy to do that with all the services out there available. And not all of those, if it gets into media, audio files, video files, computer programs, I even wonder like equations and physics and chemistry and math. Some of that stuff is not narrative, and it may not be found. Google often will discover something as being not plagiarized, but being a copyright infringement in terms of music or video. But it's very tricky. So define it for your own class. And what I should say, I should add to this and say, really, what constitutes plagiarism in your class might not be words or narrative, right? It could be an equation, it could be a graphic image, it could be a video file, an audio file, and so forth. Now, if you want to find any of these policies, these are all available on the Teaching and Learning website. And let me just put in the chat room. So what I would recommend is when you go to the syllabus website, go all the way to the bottom. And then this is where you'll find the various policies, conduct standards that some of you I know have used. We've had conversations, unfortunately, about challenging student conduct. But I would recommend clicking on this or downloading it, and this will take you directly to the college's policy. And it defines what academic dishonesty is. And this is sort of on my radar, but I'm thinking, actually, we do have it. So I take that back. Okay. It includes written work, ideas, graphs, artwork, music, maps, statistics, diagrams, scientific data, software, films, videos, and the like. Okay. So that kind of does cover it. So what you could do for your class is say, hey, this is how I'm defining plagiarism. And let me just ask you for your class, like Sean, is there anything in chemistry that's not narrative, that's like scientific data or equations that could be plagiarism that you could give as an example?
So representing someone else's work as your own, as someone else's data as your own, is 100% plagiarism. And fabricating data as well is actually, and that's actually something that in the more on the narrative side you might not see very much. Is they can go to the trouble of making something up, but if it's not real data, if they're just making up numbers, not actually measuring the numbers, that's still considered plagiarism. And or academically dishonest, at least. And then a lot of the times the only way, since we are dealing with things that are objective and cut and dry, and there is a right answer, a lot of times there's no way to tell 100% or no way to prove any sort of plagiarism unless they happen to get the same wrong answer.
Right.
When I get two students that get the same wrong answer and their work looks very, very similar and it looks nothing like what I taught them to do, then I know that they were working together. And most of the time, unless it's a test, that's fine in my classes. I tell them to work in groups, but that's really the only way to, with any sort of support and proof, to show that people are cheating on chemistry, on science tests. And I did want to mention also, I don't know if you brought this up earlier, but with the narrative stuff, I do a couple narrative assignments, and I have seen a couple of things where I think the current trick that I don't know if Turnitin has caught on to is to run it through a translator. Take it
Oh
from
yeah.
English to Spanish and then back to English.
Hmm.
And that usually changes enough words that you can tell when it's been done, unless they're really careful about it, because you get really awkward, stilted sentences.
Hmm.
But I don't think a lot of plagiarism software can catch that at this point.
That's really good. Let's try that. Is that under it's just translate, right?
Yeah, just Google Translate will do it, or there's several other programs.
Okay, so if I do it I kind of want to try that. That's I've heard of that. What about Swedish? Let's see. Okay, and then cut and paste this, and then I would just go in reverse, correct? Let's see. Or wait. No, I'd have to go do Swedish here. Okay. It might detect it, and then English here. Okay. And then let's see. I'll take a screenshot to compare it. And our second one. Okay, so this is the original. Using another's language, work, ideas, or other original material without giving proper credit to the original source. To use someone else's language, works, ideas, or other original material without getting proper source to the original source, whether done intentionally or intentionally. Yeah, so it messes it up. But then the string of probably like common words, right? Like graphs, artwork, music, that's pretty spot on. So it didn't change it that much, but it's interesting. Have you heard that like certain languages are like better at that students have discovered or?
I've mainly seen some really bad examples where you take something like the law of gravitation, and it comes
Yeah.
back as something totally different, as in the way that you should have been able to just use law of gravitation, and it comes back
Hmm.
something that would be so far removed you can't even recognize it hardly.
Yeah.
And it seems to be more in when it's really well structured writing and very, very
Hmm.
meticulous writing, like that definition, it
Yeah.
changes less. It only changed one thing in ours, really, right?
Right.
But if you
Right.
have something like, plagiarism is endemic, it looks basically like they took a thesaurus to it. Like they just
Yeah.
went through somebody else's work and changed everything that's longer than 5 letters to a different word from the thesaurus.
Yeah.
This is almost why we need, and certainly there's probably some level of AI, but with algorithms, greater artificial intelligence, because like if you had that string of text we're just looking at that had the list of graphs, statistics, and so forth. I wonder, like, if a student switched those around, they did the translation trick, and then they switched those around. Hopefully, Turnitin would still be able to spot that. But I sometimes worry about, like, in that case where the student changed every other word and I had to manually go and discover it and then highlight it, and it took me 10 hours and so forth. If that happens, then we would hopefully want the plagiarism engines to get better and better, because you almost need it to detect much more than simple, four strings of words together in a sentence. You need it to really look at like things like syntax and how it's written, and then the type of words being referenced. Again, if they're technical words, sometimes that can lead you in a direction where you say, well, where did they get this list of technical words, particularly if it didn't come from the textbook. So, yeah, that's actually a really good reminder, and I didn't put that one in there. So that's something that we need to be, I think, aware of, because that could obviously become a concern down the road if we are discovering that students are using these techniques. And I feel bad again for assuming. I'm not assuming that every student is doing this, but we're looking at the worst cases obviously today. So this is our policy. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Example of how bad it can be. I just made up a sentence. I said plagiarism is an endemic plague in higher education, and I put it to Swahili and
Hmm.
back, and I got
Hmm.
theft is a common tragedy in higher education.
Wow. That's drastic. Yeah.
So in that case, it doesn't even mean the same thing at this point,
Hmm.
but you can see how if somebody did that, you sometimes would come up with something where even the verb tenses might not even work
Yeah.
if you're not careful.
I'm just curious here because
Yeah. So here's a thing on Reddit. tip. If you want to plagiarize, translate your copied text. And these are good to look at to another language and back to English. And it talks about using Grammarly as well. Yeah. So I just, the thing that shocks me about all this is and I've said this so many times as students plagiarize, I'm like, if you just spent the time doing it honestly, it might actually be less time than going through all the trouble, because some of these plagiarism techniques, the tricks take a lot of, like the one where you're going to put periods or some character and change it to a white text in between every single word in a sentence is going to take you an hour if it's a long paper, or a couple hours. So that's what's kind of shocking to me, is this level of thought and time that goes into it when you could just do it and learn it outright, and do it honestly, and also learn what you're supposed to be learning. So again, so this is a policy, if you start to get a sense, and anyone listening to the video as well, that it needs to be revised. We have iPods on there which don't exist anymore. It might be a good time to look at. And again, I was on that. I think I was the last person who's still at the college. It was Steve Adams, who taught history and poli-sci, myself, and another part-time instructor who no longer teaches for us. And that, I want to say that was back in the early 2000s that we drafted that. So you can also go to Canvas Commons to download I think, pretty useful templates. And anytime you go to Commons, let's see if this link is going to work. I think a quick way to do this, to find our resources, is type LTCC. I think I found some of Sean's stuff in here some time ago. And go specifically to this syllabus template that comes up, and then you can find the academic dishonesty and plagiarism policy. This is a very simple page in Canvas. Again, all you'd have to do is download or import that into your Canvas class, and you could just download that one page and you're set. So if you want to take advantage of that, you don't have to like retype it or anything like that, because the PDF is not always easy to cut and paste from the catalog and to get the formatting to look correctly. So again, I think I said this earlier, but cheating could involve any kind of copying on an exam, a cheat sheet. If you tell your students in your class, even if we're virtual or Eve, that they can't work together, and they work together, as Sean discovered, and they come up with the same answer, that is, according to your definition, cheating in that class. Plagiarism, of course, is typically the narrative form, but it could also be any kind of work, like a video, audio file, computer program, and so forth. If any of you want to do exam proctoring, I did this video on Proctorio. I think it's popular. My videos don't get almost 3,000 views. My teaching videos don't get as many views as this one. This is one of the tops. So I think it says to me that across higher ed, a lot of people are interested in Proctorio. So if you're interested in using Proctorio, it's available to you. It is real-time proctoring that will use artificial intelligence to determine if a student is, looking at a cheat sheet or looking at another computer monitor. It is a little bit big brother, and I know a number of our science faculty have suggested concerns about that. I totally get that, because I don't think we should turn our educational system into an Orwellian nightmare. Even though I'm concerned about plagiarism and cheating, I wouldn't want to sacrifice, a good experience for 98% of our students who don't cheat or plagiarize. So if you want to use Proctorio, I think it's totally entirely your call. Go ahead, Sean.
I just think that's sort of I'm one of those science faculty who is against Proctorio. Mm-hmm. And I just, to me, it just speaks to not wanting to change with the times in a way that's not necessarily helpful, because
right.
If our students have these resources in front of them all the time, maybe we'd be serving them better by teaching them how to use these resources and restructuring our tests.
Yeah.
But then again, it's hard to do with something like math, where there's so many resources out there that can just do math for you. So I won't speak for the math. I know the math department uses Proctorio a lot, and I get that in that situation. But it's in sciences in particular, it seems like it's a good idea to sort of try and restructure things. It's a good opportunity to push us to do that right now,
right?
Since we don't have a choice. But again, that's just my take.
It's a great point. And, I did some of that. I was obviously allowing open book exams for all my online classes. going back years. I've been, I think, since 2004 or 2005 teaching online. And then at some point I said, why am I not then doing open book exams for my in-person classes? So I made the switch, as you're talking about, and it actually saved me 4 hours of class time more for lecture and discussion and group work, because I said, all of you just go to the Canvas site. The exam's due on this date on your syllabus. You do it. It's open book, and we're not going to waste time in class to do an exam or even the quizzes. So restructuring is another way of dealing with some of this. It's not on here. We should add it, to really restructure and to say, maybe I will move towards more open book exams or quizzes if that works, because it's not cheating then anymore, right? It's taking the time to do the work. And believe me, I have most of my classes open book exams. It's not all A's and B's. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a blow-off class just because it's open book. So this is going back to what we talked about earlier. Are there consequences? Do we have enforcement? This seems a little harsh, but it was talking about a Polish professor who could serve a 3-year sentence for plagiarism. Again, it could vary by country to country. Again, going back to my example of a former A&P instructor at the college professor, it does matter if someone cheats, because if you cheat your way through anatomy and physiology, and you become a doctor or a nurse and you kill someone or severely harm them because you didn't learn what you needed to learn, there is consequence to cheating. And I think it's typically the sciences and medicine and engineering, bridge building or something like that, where we give those examples because, if you get your master's degree in comparative literature and you cheated your way to get there, it's bad, but are you going to negatively harm someone? You might be a bad teacher. You might be a hack teacher because you cheated your way through school, but there are consequences for not learning the knowledge and, cheating our way through school or whatever. So it's just an important reminder there. The common ways to avoid plagiarism detection. We need to add Sean's to the list, of course. The Google Translate is digital modifications. So letter substitution. So this is an example of that, where you could do hidden modifications with text color, with Cyrillic language and so forth. And we'll look at Turnitin in a second. They've actually updated their engines to detect, I think, all of these. Making up references, inserting white text. So what you would see here is there would be hidden text here that's in white that would try to trick Turnitin's engine, because every little bit of information, if you will, in between all the letters in the sentence would try to throw off the engine. And then there's also format modification. So different approaches that can be taken. So I think it's important to be aware of these, and hopefully, again, we can use that first step, which is our intuition, the light bulb that goes off, because some of these could be very hard to detect. And let's cross our fingers that Turnitin will cover all this, but if not, then it becomes really a concern. Now, here's one way that 100% a student could avoid plagiarism every single time. And this is something I've said over the years, is if anyone is available or able to pay for a custom essay to be written, then definitely it could happen and you might not detect it. And this is from one of those plagiarism websites. These were the tricks that you may help you find a way to cheat Turnitin, and you won't always get away with cheating. This program has flaws, blah, blah, blah. And it just says here, if you cannot complete the assignment on your own, stick to more reliable methods like rewriting or ordering paper, not very well written, from professional essay writing services. You'll receive custom essay and won't be accused of plagiarism. That is not written too great, is it? But it's just shocking to see these, and this is an example of one of those sites. Or actually, this is how to cheat Turnitin. This is not the essay mill site. So this is the site I quoted there. So all this information about, paraphrasing, ordering the paper from a custom writing service, adjusting the language, and so forth. So I just think it's really, shocking that this kind of stuff, and I think this is actually one. This is a writing service website. And what's shocking to me about this is they have people here, with the word professor. You click on their profiles, and they have a review, and they talk about the subjects that they work in. I'm sure these are fake names and fake pictures and stuff, but I just think it's scandalous that this exists. But in a free society, you can pay for this. You can hire the writer. They'll do it all for you. And I don't know how either the writer who's doing it, helping the student cheat, feels good about this, or how the cheater feels good about it. I find it absolutely shocking. And again, it goes back to my earlier points that it really is about values. And hopefully as a college, we can stress some of these values and to try to hold the line and so forth when we talk about this with our students. Again, you can see here, $11 per page. You can choose the type of essay, an admission essay. Imagine that, right? You're getting someone to write your admission essay for you. A business plan, a case study, a movie review, the number of words. You can choose rewriting and editing. It talks about, so it's almost like an iterative process where you go back and forth with the ghostwriter to get, that perfect cheating paper that you can turn in. And as I said, you can even choose the letter grade. So you can have them custom write a C-level paper such that you can hopefully fool the professor who's reading it. So just really, really challenging to think about this. So to get into the nuts and bolts, we're going to jump right into turn it in here to see what it looks like. And I just want to show you a couple of these screenshots. When you first set this up, I think it's for the new plagiarism tool. This information will pop up that shows you just kind of the FAQs, and I don't know if that will appear later, so I actually put this up as screenshots. It's pretty self-explanatory. So you'll see that there's going to be flag text, and then you can click on that flag text to see the potential plagiarism detected. It will have a similarity percentage, so 70% means higher possibility of plagiarism. So the higher the percentage is, the greater likelihood, in the opinion of Turnitin, that it is plagiarism. Whereas if it's 2% or 10%, less likelihood. Kind of makes sense. And it will show you the matching text with different colors, and you can click on those text examples to see possibly what the sources were so you can investigate further. And the same thing with Proctorio. If Proctorio detects anomalies during the exam, you get to go in, look at those anomalies, and decide if it's meaningful or not, and then take punishment in mind or enforcement of your class policies in terms of deducting a letter grade or whatever is that you do. So I always say that as a backup to the Orwellian nature of some of this is that you get to decide as the instructor how to act on the data that's been collected and analyzed by Turnitin. Now on the settings, we're going to look at this in real time. There are some choices about what you can include or exclude. So looking at Canvas, this is what you're going to see. Again, if you see a high percentage, that will be possibly something to look at. So let's jump right into Canvas here. I'll take you to one of my classes. And we'll just show you the basics of setting this up. And as more questions come up, we can continue to workshop and discuss this. So the easiest way is to go to Assignments. And by the way, if you ever want to check something that's not an official assignment, at any time, create a dummy assignment and then use that dummy assignment to check for plagiarism. You don't have to have an official assignment that's live in your class. So I can just put in there test assignment. Again, whether or not I make it live, if I give it points or not, I can decide on that. But this is where I'd want to make sure typically I would have all these checked. Media recordings, Turnitin will not check media recordings, but anything that is text-based, Turnitin will be able to look at and determine whether or not there's potential plagiarism. So this is where I would go to this is new to Turnitin now in Canvas. Under your assignment, look at Plagiarism Review, and there's only one option, it's Turnitin, and then this new window comes up. It takes a second to load. So it's sort of three choices here, excluding submission of indexing and similarity reports. This one I typically don't touch. I guess you could choose it immediately and on due date. This, I think, gets more into whether or not you want your students to see the plagiarism reports. This is really up to you as an instructor. Some instructors like students to see because it's a learning opportunity to say, oh, this was plagiarized. You need to go back and do a second draft. In the last session, Mary Cook specifically asked about this, and if you wanted to, you could choose not to index submissions. So indexing submissions will create almost a database of any papers in your classes, such that if you reuse that assignment, hopefully over, I don't know how long it does this for, but if it has it on file for a year or two, then if a student takes another student's paper and submits it as their own, it will detect that as being plagiarized, even though, let's say, student one actually wrote it from scratch, did a legit job, but then student two cut and pasted that paper, which was not plagiarized originally, but they submitted it as their own. So if you're doing a series of drafts in your classes, to answer Mary's question from last time, the two things I would recommend is maybe not indexing the submissions, or indexing the submissions and then not showing the students the results. Because I think if you don't show the students their results, then potentially you're just seeing it, and it would not really be an issue. You can also choose to exclude from bibliography or from quotations. You can also, and this is where you would choose whether or not you want students to see it. Do you want them to see it immediately, after the assignment is graded, after the due date, or never? I personally leave it on never, but that's only because of my class and my style. It doesn't matter. But if you want to use it as a teaching tool, choose one of these three top options. If you don't want students to ever to see it because you want to use it as a deterrence, which is a little Orwellian, I suppose, a little bit of policing there, then you would maybe put it as never. Okay, so that's how you set up that assignment. It's pretty easy. Pretty easy to do. Now let me take you to an actual assignment, and you can see what this looks like if it detects plagiarism. So all I did was I found a source on the internet on a random topic, and I cut and pasted that into my assignment. And indeed, this was on the American Civil War. And so this is, I just went to Wikipedia, I cut and pasted, as Sean said, if you don't take out your hyperlinks, that's a pretty good sign to your instructor that you probably cheated. So you can choose up here in the plagiarism interface, the paper view or the plain text view. So it looks fairly, kind of similar there. Probably what you want to do is click on the similarity score. So again, if it's a 77%, there's a pretty high likelihood that something was taken from internet sources. The minute I click on it, it will then take me into a more detailed view. And this has gotten better over the years. And what you can do is you can look at all your sources, your source overview here. So if there's something that has a really big flag, and what's curious is, in my years using plagiarism software, I've actually detected legit journal articles that have like sources of plagiarism in them. And I find that pretty shocking and disturbing as well, that researchers out there are potentially, plagiarizing. And hopefully those were mistakes. But what happens is you see a multiple list of sources, because over time, someone who's writing something on the Civil War for a class site or some blog or whatever might just cut and paste that into their site. And so over time, you get almost like a diluting or a sharing of the original, if you will, from Wikipedia and all these other sites. So typically it's going to be at the top, the one that has the most, that's been used the most. So that's going to be Wikipedia. And if I wanted to, I could scroll through, and I believe this is a little new to me as well. You can choose what you might want to exclude on here. And this, I think, will allow me to look at the entire full text of it to see everything.
Scott, I have to jump off here.
Yeah, go for it.
In 5 minutes, but thanks.
Yeah, thanks for attending, Sean. Appreciate it. Appreciate your comments today. And we'll wrap up here in a couple minutes. Just wanted to show you kind of the end of this. But if you wanted to, then you could start clicking on any of these sources, and they should open up in a window. I think I have it on exclude text, so I can also go through this here. For some reason, it's kind of, I don't know why this is locking up, but this is a little new how they have it for me as well, the sources. But what I like to do is look at really the majority, so that main one, which is the 36%, and then I would begin to see what the source of the plagiarism was. And I can, again, continue to scroll. It's being a little slow here, so. But that is the gist of it. So that is what you will see as far as the type of information that Turnitin gives to you. And again, what I recommend is take that information and use it as you wish. So if you decide to penalize the student in a certain way or have a conversation with the student, maybe you require them to meet with you and put them on the spot. We used to do this more as a college, where we would have meetings with the dean, myself, and the student, and they would have to sit there and really explain themselves. And in a lot of those cases, I discovered it was a great learning experience for the student. They came clean and they admitted, look, I made a mistake. I was dishonest. I won't do it again. So if it's a learning opportunity for our students, I feel like something like that could be really worthwhile. It is kind of intense and intimidating for the student, but it also maybe gets the student to realize that they need to think about not doing that in the future. So hopefully that's the case, that they learn from it and they never do it again. So kind of recommendations to close before some short Q&A. I would say every class, again, should use the LTCC academic dishonesty policy. Clearly define what constitutes dishonesty in your class. Again, looking at Solange on the call today, if you're doing audio, if you're doing video, graphic design, put something in there that says, unless I tell you you can reuse materials in an audio mix that you're doing, you cannot do that. Clearly define that, because if you do it after the fact, then it becomes kind of a case like almost like you should give the student a second chance because you weren't very clear in what you defined as plagiarism. Yeah, go ahead, Solange.
There really is no such thing as Turnitin for media, is there?
No, the only thing would be any sites that a Google image search. There's a reverse image lookup that's pretty handy. So if you did have a student who turned in, let's say a poster, they had to make a graphic poster for your class. If you suspect it as being too professional or too whatever, you could use Google's image search lookup, and that often can take you to the original site. It may not work all the time. If it is something like media, I've actually had some of my music tracks flagged on YouTube, very strange. And I think it might actually relate to similarity between, a VST, audio program that I'm using in my audio production program that another artist used, and maybe that similarity of sound, if it was just one note held down, it got flagged as being what do you call it? Not plagiarism, but a trademark infringement. So YouTube actually has very good engines. You could always run that video through, if you have a YouTube channel or an audio file, you could run that through YouTube. And if YouTube detects it, there's a pretty good chance then that you could say, well, yeah, this was plagiarized or taken from another source. But it's not as easy to do what you're talking about. So I would recommend Google reverse image. For media and audio, you could definitely use YouTube for some of that, because their engines are pretty darn sophisticated in terms of what they detect, either as a visual source that's trademarked and used without permission, or an audio source. So that would be my recommendation. Much harder to do, though, compared to text, like 20 times, 100 times harder. Second recommendation is incorporate the technology that you need in your class to deal with this. If it's Proctorio, if it's Turnitin, use it. If you don't need Turnitin, if plagiarism is not going to happen in your class because students write really short prompts that literally couldn't be plagiarized because they're directly related to what you're talking about, like a software application, you don't have to go through Turnitin and use it if you don't want to. Let the students know that it exists. Let the students know that it's there as a mild deterrent. Again, I don't think it should be Orwellian, but definitely let them know that it's there. Be sure to check all areas of your class for possible dishonesty, including discussion posts. This definitely happens. I think I have an example of this in a second. And then also, we should all be involved in a culture of academic honesty and integrity. And I thought I had an example. I guess I didn't include that, but I just wanted to make the point about this discussion post. Years ago, I had visited a class, and I actually discovered in that class that a good deal of the discussion posts that the instructor had set up, like 60% of them, I want to guess, were actually plagiarized. The students are getting the idea that there is a culture in your class of allowing academic dishonesty and plagiarism because you're not checking things and you're not making sure that the work is original even in your discussion posts. So I think that's very important to check all areas of your class, even if it's not an exam or a class paper. Just make sure that you don't have students committing any kind of dishonesty. So I know we covered a lot here, I talked a lot, but Any other questions or comments or thoughts about plagiarism, academic dishonesty, anything we didn't cover today?
Yeah, Solange, I think you're muted.
What if the instructor is giving a lecture based on readings in a book? If the readings from the book is identified, does that still count as plagiarisms, even though the credit is given as this is from a book?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That's a good question. So what I would do is, and I think this would come up, really good question, with a video, particularly if you publish that video. So what I always do is, if I'm reading someone else's work, then I would reference it and say, and I'm taking this quote or idea from this particular book. So no, that would not be plagiarism. The only time it would be is if you publish that somehow and then you didn't give credit to that author. Yeah, so that would be totally fine. And there are cases where people actually encourage you to reuse. There's a whole remix culture. Years ago, Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails released all his, I think they were in Logic, all his WAV files of it was a series of their tracks that they did. And it was every single track from the song. So you're talking like 50 tracks, vocal, drums, all the, various audio files. And they were telling people, we want you to use these, we want you to remix them, and you could put these online. So if you get permission, a lot of times from the artists or the authors, then there are, of course, exceptions to the rule. But it's perfectly fine what you're doing. If you're giving a lecture and you're using someone else's work, as long as you give credit, you're perfectly fine with doing that. So, but good question. So, okay, so I think we'll call it quits on that. And again, those of you watching the video, if you didn't attend live, reach out if you have other questions we didn't get to or answer. Other tricks out there that maybe you want to be aware of that students are using to evade detection, then definitely get in touch and we can set up another